Welcome everyone to this afternoon's Artfluence Festival discussion. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are in the world. My name is Nikki. I am a dancer, I'm a choreographer. I'm also the chairperson of the Theatre and Dance Alliance, and I will be the moderator for this panel discussion that is focused on a very interesting topic, shaping identity through migration, using art to express the marginalization of traveling in search of human rights. We can ask a few questions under this theme, like if artists are making work about their experience, is their nationality necessary to mention? Or what are the connotations that come with referring to an artist by the place they come from or reside in? Does an immigrant artist have to make work about this? And what happens if they don't? I'm hoping that by the end of our discussion this afternoon, we'll be able to answer some of these questions. So I'm really, really excited. And I'm even more excited because I'm in the company of some really incredible women, one that is here local with us and one who is international. So it's really going to be a fruitful conversation. I don't want to take their spotlight, so I'm going to give each one of them an opportunity to introduce themselves, tell us who you are, where you're coming from, a one-liner of what you do, and then we'll bring the conversation back around. So I will start with our local guest, Christina.
Thanks, Lesejo. Hello, everyone. It's really great to be here this afternoon. I'm Christina Johnston. I live in Pretoria at the moment. I grew up in Belgium. Then I came and studied dance in South Africa. So I've worked here as a dancer, as a choreographer, as a teacher. I spent a few years in Kampala in Uganda as well, working with different dance communities there. I've just completed a research project at the Wits School of Arts, looking at questions of representation, identity, dance making, creative practice. And now I teach full-time in a drama program, working with students, doing very hands-on work in movement and physical theatre.
Awesome, so lovely to see you here, Christina. And I will jump over to our international guest, Nikki.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Lesejo and Christina. Great to be here. Thank you to Artfluence and the Centre for Creative Arts. I'm Nikki Jonah. I'm based in the UK. My parents are Nigerian. I've lived in, my early career was in New York, and the work that I do is about creating space. I've created and co-founded a platform called the Pan-African Creative Exchange. It takes place every 2 years in Bloemfontein in South Africa. So we will do the next one in September this year. And currently, on top of all of that, I'm a postgraduate researcher at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, and I'm quite interested in Pan-African performance networks and the cultural intermediaries, particularly those solo people that tend to be holding up the sector. So if anyone knows of anyone, please chuck them my way. Thanks.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much, Nikki. And we would have been sitting here with Ugandan-born and now residing in Rwanda, Bathsheba Ncube, but unfortunately, due to a medical emergency, she cannot be here with us, but she is with us in spirit. So, hey, Bathsheba, I know you're watching. All right, so I'm going to keep the conversation going and come to you, Nikki. You know, all over the world, we've seen how art has played a vital role in advocating for human rights. I mean, as an example, during apartheid in South Africa, we saw many artists in exile who were using their art as a voice for the struggle for liberation, the likes of Miriam Makeba, among many others. Now, in your work with the Pan-African Creative Exchange, the idea of traveling in pursuit of human rights and the effects thereof on migrants and refugees, that must be front of mind. What, in your opinion, are the intersections of artistic practice and advocacy practice?
Wow. I think first and foremost, the main reason why we set up PACE in Africa was because of issues around mobility. Like artists get invited and then they can't get off, can't get the visa. So there's always a question of the visibility, like do people even know who they are? And secondly, can they actually get to those meeting points, those places where everyone meets and makes decisions about policy and shape policy and think about direction and travel for the arts? Most of the time, Africans aren't in the room. And because of my positionality, the fact that I have a British passport, I'm able to be a little bit more fluid, but I recognize there's a massive challenge and massive inequalities around that. So I think a lot of the advocacy for us is a shift on how Africa is presented. So all part of that whole rebrand narrative, not always keeping it in that traditional sort of primitive space that a lot of people tend to present Africa in, particularly we see it a lot here in the West. I think also about us being there, being on the continent, because the context is king. If you're not on the continent, you can't really see, you sort of think you get it, but you don't. And also there's a sense of empowerment for the artists if you're coming to see them in that space. I think also what we find is that we advocate for certain groups. So we know that LGBTQ rights, especially in East Africa and also in West Africa, is very precarious and it's very difficult. So within our space, we try to create a safe space where those artists can present their voice or find a more intimate network of artists and just feel like they're part of a bigger Pan-African worldwide family. So that's some of the ways that we do that. We also try to, like for instance, we've just done the selection process for the next Pan-African Creative Exchange, which will take place in October. And one of the things I was quite mindful of was those people who are artists, but somehow end up doing other things like sort of what you both do, sitting on all these boards, helping shaping policy, and how do they get their space to still be an artist? Because sometimes you spend so much time doing the heavy lifting policy stuff, you don't actually get a chance to kind of develop your own practice, and that sort of gets sidelined. So I'm quite interested in actually how do you create space for what I'm calling the cultural intermediaries? How do you create space for them to be able to still bring their full self, but still bring the advocacy work and all those other things? So it's a bit of, because that's kind of, we're in a very complex, precarious environment that is subject to change at any time. And we, on the continent, I'm proud to say, are very good at responding and having some kind of pushback that we had to learn to do more here with the lockdown. So there was a lot for us to learn from people in the global south in order to be able to build a bit more resilience. So I think in terms of the migrant, I think it allows, our space allows people to understand each other, because Africans, I mean, I know in South Africa, a lot of people make comments about the fact I'm Nigerian, they always are shocked. And then once they get over the shock, they'll say, oh, you know, what, Nigerian? And most of the time they speak to me in their languages because nobody believes I'm not South African. So it's kind of interesting how my experience is different. I have an English accent, I don't look Nigerian, but Nigerians have their own thing, Ghanaians have their own thing. And actually, how do we start to really understand each other and really kind of push aside some of those stereotypes and some of those things that don't grow us as a community? So I think that answers your question, Ms. Echo.
More than answered my question, actually, and you've touched on so many other really intricate things about the topic that we're speaking about, and I could touch on all of them and I'll try and come back to them. But you spoke about, you know, people like myself and Christina who are doing the work that we are doing, even though that at the heart of it, we are artists. But there is a reason to do it. And I think, Christina, this is a good opportunity to ask you about your practice. You know, in your recent work of Tree Song, which is a physical theatre dance performance that in your own words, you say was specifically created for children between the ages of 1 and 4 years old who are deaf or have very little hearing, some of whom use hearing technologies. Now, I know it was inspired by your son, who was born with very little hearing. And I loved reading about the spontaneity that often arose from how you set this performance piece. So please do tell us a little bit more about this creation, and more specifically, how the issues being displaced in pursuit of human rights have influenced your work. Keeping in mind what Nikki has really highlighted about us finding that balance between advocating and then still being artists and then still finding our identity, and now your son's identity through your work. Talk us through a little bit of that.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot that I really want to respond to from Nikki. And, interestingly, when I saw the provocation for this conversation this afternoon, my mind didn't go to the tree song immediately. I didn't connect this work of mine with this particular question around shaping identity, migration, advocacy. But yes, I can tell you about the tree song, which is, as you said, it's a dance work or a physical theatre work. It's sound making and movement storytelling for children between 1 and 4 years old, so very young audience, from baby up to sort of toddler, early years, kindergartner, and very much made for my son. I'm kind of following him developmentally, and he's now gone to grade 1 and learning to read. So I think that my next work is probably about reading and reading practices and things like that. So I'm kind of following him through my creative practice. And my experience of artistic work for children has been that we often think from the mainstream, or we think from the center, and then adapt work for the other. We then we adapt it for children who have special needs. But I really wanted to look at making a work from a place of difference, or difference as a thinking place in itself, as a way to open up questions that we can all learn from, to look at the richness of my son's experience. He's deaf, he wears a cochlear implant and a hearing aid, he does use spoken language, he's on the autism spectrum, he has a different way of being in the world than I do. And so he's my greatest master. I learn from my child about being in the world, and it has opened me to thinking about the world differently and being open to different experiences of the world. So what is the richness of a place of difference to create work, to investigate embodied practice? That'd be my motivation there. And then, I say this sort of flippantly sometimes. I often feel like every child in South Africa is a special needs child. With the amount of trauma, with the socioeconomic climate, every child needs a special needs attention. So what can we learn from special needs places and thinking from difference to open up new ways of doing things? How can we advocate democracy through this different thinking place? And then I don't know if I'm not getting ahead of myself, that's the tree song, but just in response to what Nikki was sharing, what's also really close to my heart is this idea of communities of practice and research. All my work is collaborative. So the tree song was made in conversation with the artists, very collaborative in the space. The children become co-creators. The children bring movement proposals, sound proposals that are taken up by the performers. So the idea of a community of practice and research is really important to me. And having also sort of worked in Cape Town and worked in Kampala, I also noticed how the roots of cultural exchange and these communities are often already mapped for us. Those maps are there, and it's predetermined who you'll interact with and who you can talk with and who you can work with. And I love the idea of opening that up. One of the things in Kampala that we used to laugh about with the dance community there is that a lot of the dancers there would go and train in places like Senegal, and you would have to fly from Uganda to get to Dakar. You would fly via Paris. Like that route was just already mapped for people. And so the idea of creating communities of practice and research around difference is, I think, close to my heart in my practice. I'll leave it there for now, but I've got lots sparking.
Thank you, Christina. I was really quite intrigued reading the article on your work, because it's also the difference in audience reaction that you invoke in the work that you created. It's work that is created for children between the ages of 1 and 4, and you speak about how sometimes you have these children coming onto the stage and crawling on the stage, and the natural reaction of their parents would be grab the child and remove the child from the stage. But you encourage that kind of reaction to say, and to me, what I hear is a freedom of expression, not just from the artist's point of view, but from the audience point of view. And I think this is really important when we speak about migrants and how migrants are able to create their work. Do they really have the freedom of expression in their work while they're consistently expected to create a certain kind of narrative because they are migrants? And, I just want to bring it back to you, Nika. What are your experiences in the work that you're doing? And you did touch on this a little bit earlier on, but I think if you can just go a little bit deeper, what are your experiences on positively shifting the image of migrants and refugees, particularly in the work that you're doing?
Mic back on. For about 3 years, I worked for an organisation called Counterpoints Arts. And Counterpoints Arts are in the field of arts, migration and culture change. And their mission is to support and produce arts by and about migrants and refugees, ensuring that their contributions are recognised and welcomed within British arts history and culture. Really important, and they've been going for about 10 years now. And as part of that programme, I led a programme called Pop Change, and Pop Change was about how we could use the power of the pop culture space to shift the way we think and talk about migration here in the UK. And for anyone who's had their eye on the UK, it's been horrendous. It's been chaotic, confusing, quite depressing, because I grew up being called names every single day, and then it stopped at some point. And now anyone with an accent, including people who are white, get called names, and those people would get a pass in the past, but now it's kind of everyone get a Far Island, and literally 1 million plus people left, and we haven't got enough people to do the work now. So there's that. Then we've got the whole Rwanda thing that's happening right now. Let's ship anyone who takes illegal routes to England to Rwanda for processing. We are fobbing them off to Africa to put the claim is it's to put off these illegal traffickers, but actually it's to play to the kind of far right who don't want migration here, and particularly brown migration. So a lot of the work I was doing was thinking about ways that we could shift that. So I thought, let me not go to the performing arts. I know that. I moved into football, fashion, because that's my background, and I needed something that I understood. I don't understand football, gaming, and then we did something around comedy. And in the football project, we got a lovely, wonderful artist called Lady Leisha, who's huge now in the UK, to work over a course of about maybe like a month on lockdown on Zoom with football fans to create a football song. You know, the songs that they sing in the stadiums, and to kind of encourage the team, or to kind of jeer the other team, or to also throw out racial abuse. She created a really fun football anthem that she had loads of fans film themselves, and then they created a video and they shared it. So that was one of the projects. And as part of that project, we did something called Fun Facts. So we gave people an insight to how much migrant communities are very much part of the Premier League and UK football. So I think it went from something like 1% in 1974 of the players were from migrant backgrounds. And then by sort of 2019, it was something like 17%. And then it's something like more than half of the players have non-British passports. it's just to kind of get people to think about, and there's a lot going on within the Football Association and all those big sort of like umbrella organizations, but we felt like using pop culture to push this out was quite a nice agenda. The other thing we did with comedy is we had a fantastic initiative called No Direction Home, and it was training refugee and migrant communities how to become a stand-up comedian. And they used quite a famous comedian called Tom Parry. He's had a lot of success with television, and then he brought in his other friends, like, I don't know if you guys know Ramesh Raghunathan and Nish Kumar, and those guys, like huge guys. And so once a month, refugee migrant community people who were training would get up on stage and they would do a stand-up comedy set. And some of them would just be hilarious because they would mix up their English, and so that became part of the fun of it. But some of them would just use it to kind of tell their stories about observations of coming to England as a migrant, which was really good fun. And they always had a big turnout, and they always had a lot of people encouraging them. And then at the end of the year, what they would do is they would have a big event as part of the Refugee Week Festival, which Counterpoint Arts also ran. And then they would have a Ramesh Raghunathan or one of those big guys headlining with all these other guys, which was fantastic. The other project we did was a project with a youth group. So what we used to do every year is we would have a pop culture and social change retreat that would always look at migration and how we can shift this. But we'd invite people from all over the world, from different sectors, charity sector, fashion, film, narrative change. And within this, I gave them a task and I said, when you Google certain things, you only come up with a particular kind of look and an image. So for instance, if you Google refugee in the UK, you do the same Google search in the US, in Greece, in Italy, in Turkey, the images were identical. And that got us thinking as to why. And the why around that was because the Google fetches from credible search engines, and those search engines, in short, are Eurocentric, they're racist. And so what happens is if you Google Yemen, you get lots of young guys with AK-47s and in army fatigues, and none of the spec that you get about how many people live there, what the capital is, you don't get that. You get all these sort of negative terrorist image. So what these young people did is they've got this thing called Tag It Right, and it was about really delving into that and finding different ways to shift the way we think and talk about migration. So they used TikTok and they got people to talk about where they were from. And what was quite interesting, a lot of the English kids went home and asked their parents. A lot of them found out that they had migration somewhere back in the family that just didn't get talked about. So it was interesting how people got to think about it. Also, I think the thing that it threw up for me was it is so grey. You'll find people in England who are absolutely hardcore open borders, except don't want too many brown people, don't want too many Muslims, don't mind the Muslims as long as they dress like us. So you get all of those complex differences, which makes it a bit of a minefield to navigate. So you're constantly navigating on so many levels. You're thinking about the narrative shift and what needs to happen in the narrative. And you see now that when people talk about Ukraine, people now say, what about Afghanistan? People have gone to fight in all these different places and they were labeled as terrorists, but English people are going over to Ukraine, even though they've been told not to go, they've almost been labeled as heroes. Ukrainians are coming because they're running from war, and people are opening up the houses. They've got the Homes for Ukraine scheme. Whereas Afghan and Syrians were like, well, when we were running, we were treated really badly. There was no clear routes, legal immigration routes in. So what you're finding now is a lot of Ukrainian artists or artists that have spent time in Ukraine are wearing that badge. They're saying, I'm Ukraine. And of course, you're seeing funding shifted. A lot of funding pots are now, we have a special pot for Ukraine artists. Some organizations have gone as far to support the changemaker activists coming out of Russia because they recognize that they too are at risk. Some of them have been locked up. I know one particular person, she's managed to escape, but she can't go back. She's not safe because she's always really spoken out against the government. So you're finding that I think that people, the market depicts how you define yourself. Sometimes it works for you and you're going to use it, especially at a time like this, if everyone's got that interest. And there's other times you might lean into another part of your identity. I think when I was in America, I used to struggle. If I'd go from New York to Miami and someone would say to me, where are you from? I felt the need to have to say, I'm born in the UK, my parents are Nigerian, but I live in New York. I felt like I needed to say that. I couldn't say I'm from New York because I felt like I wasn't, but I felt like I couldn't say I was from the UK because then people would say, but you're not really, are you? Where are you from? Artists will, depending on where they're at the beginning of the journey, they might want to wear that badge because it's important for them to show solidarity to their fellow countrymen. But other times they might want to lead with being a mum. They might want to lead with the particular focus of the work or the practice around the work. I think it really depends. I think I often define myself as British Nigerian, but I always myself Nigerian. I was getting set bills for college when I was younger. My mom said, you can't put down you're Nigerian because you're not. And I said, what am I then? She said, you were born here, so you're British. But I struggled for a long time to call myself British because I didn't really feel like I fit. And it's only when I went to New York and people would say she's British, Nigerian, and introduced me with that biography, and it just sort of stuck. So yeah.
You know, and Nikki, you've touched on once again so many multi-layered themes that we're going to come back to. The first being comedy, and I do want to go back to the comedy issue. But now that we're speaking about identity again, you've kind of brought it back around identity. You know, in fact, I can actually link them together. Trevor Noah, who's a South African comedian, when he went over to the USA, I think his first special, he called it Coming to America or Coming in America, something about coming to America or the likes. And predominantly most of his comedy skit was around him being a South African, but also being a mixed race South African and what that meant in an apartheid climate with a Swiss dad and a Xhosa mom, and then also what it meant to be a South African in America because of the way that he looks. So he doesn't really look Black American, so now he looks like he might be Latino. It is just so interesting that you mentioned that the first thing he did when he got to America was create this special all about his identity as a South African. And I think that might have been to him. And like you say, some people want to lead with the fact that they are a dad or they're a mom or whatever it is. But sometimes I think as a migrant, it's easier to just go that route, especially when you come from a country that is so historically rich in the issues of race and identity and prejudice and all those things. That might actually just be so much easier to fall back on that. But Nikki, Christina, I'm going to come back to you on the topic of identity. You know, it is such a broad topic, one's identity as a citizen of a particular nation, like one that you reside in, South Africa, or on a broader scale as a migrant or a refugee, if that is the case. I would have asked this question to somebody else, but she's not here. But I'd like to know, should identity then be part of practice, which bleeds into this issue of Trevor Noah and what we've just been discussing?
Unmute. Identity, and this phrasing that you used, Nikki, was so rich, this leaning into different parts of one's identity. And I think I really relate to this question. I mean, in the blurb, even for this conversation, I refer to myself as Belgian South African, and I do it differently depending on, you know, my mood of the day, I suppose. My mom is from Finland. My father is South African, and in the old apartheid terminology, a colored South African. And because of that mixed race marriage, I couldn't become a South African until after 94. So I grew up as a Belgian in Belgium, not being Belgian really. So I relate with this idea of almost leaning into different parts of one's identity, changing it up depending on what you think your needs might be for a particular conversation. And I have a son now who's half Ugandan and half whatever I am. So I think it's a really important question. I do think that identity as part of practice or locating oneself is an important thing to do, precisely because these maps have often been created for us, and it is often so clear what the center is and what is at the margin. We can't get away from like the colonial matrix of power. So I think it is really important to pay attention or to like signpost who is speaking and where are you speaking from, where are they speaking from, because it helps us shift the narrative and shift the center, and also notice that we can do that we can change who's participating in the conversation. So I do think that signposting is really useful. In my own experience, I think what I've started to do more is like delving into an autoethnographic description. So also, well, what are my practices? If I grew up in Belgium, what are the epistemologies that I came into contact with? And what is now part of my detraining now that I am working and living in South Africa? Because I do think that there's a lot of detraining that needs to be done. I mean, I've been schooled in a very particular way. Had a classical education in what the Belgians call it, but I think it's about becoming almost more detailed in talking about who you are in relation to your work, adding those details, layering in those details, and I think that's where you see how intricate the fabric of a practitioner really is. Like, it's not just where they're from, the national borders, like, of the nation state are not enough. It's the epistemologies, it's the practices. Who have you trained with? Who's part of your history as a practitioner? All of these things. So I think what I've learned to do is to make my story more intricate in its telling. But I do, depending on the situation, lean into different parts of identity almost as I need them. I'll leave it there, Lesejo.
Thank you, Christina. And you mentioned something, I'll paraphrase, but in reclaiming our identity, there's a lot of undoing that also needs to be done. For example, coming from an African context, historically, borders were really non-existent in Africa. So when we start to talk about reclaiming our identity as Africans and African practitioners, it becomes difficult to not fall into the issue of tribalism. It becomes difficult to not fall into the issue of nationalism. And then it becomes difficult to not fall into the issue of race, which is at the crux. But those conversations become important when you're trying to reclaim your identity. And I'm speaking now as an African in Africa. So maybe I'll pass this to you, Nikki, if identity and representation were to move away from the colonial constructs that were problematic from the beginning, the colonial constructs that fell into tribalism, and now we're looking at these borders and everything that we're dealing with and having to undo, if that is what it means, then does this move, reclaiming our identity politics, does this not leave us stuck with the construct of race?
I'm not sure within our lifetime that this will all be deconstructed. I think all these constructs of the binary have put us into problems. Man, woman, old, young, body, spirit, black, white, gay, straight. There's all these constructs, and every time you look around you, you're realizing that everything is constructed. Even the continent of Africa, it is constructed and carved up. And recently I watched on Netflix The Making of a Nation, and it was about the history of Nigeria, how it became Nigeria, and it was so interesting because I grew up in England. My younger brother and sister grew up in the north of Nigeria, actually was known to be the most peaceful part of Nigeria, and they know nothing about European history. all their history is around the history of West Africa, all the Songhai kingdoms. They know about the sort of traditions and things. Slavery was touched upon in a very different way to the way I learned slavery here. So it's I think what Christina was saying about the undoing, that's been a challenge for me, is I've constantly been in this space of undoing, but part of it comes from my parents being highly aware of us not becoming too English. They wanted African kids, we're not African enough, so that's why my little brother and sister ended up going to Nigeria. My mum was like, someone has to completely be able to relate to me. But I think there is something about, I don't know, the race, I feel for me, it comes into everything. It's part of your waking thought, especially when you're in the rest. I kind of feel it also in South Africa, if I'm honest, but when I go to places like Senegal and the Gambia, it feels very different. It's really weird. I guess it depends where you are again and who you are. Now, when I used to do a lot of work in the Netherlands, I used to get invited to do a lot of talks, and I got to meet a lot of Black Dutch people. And they would describe some of the challenges they had. And I realized that they have an English accent, and people quite like the English accent, even within Europe. They sort of look up to Black Brits. I get a different type of opportunity than somebody who's a Black Dutch person. But the same could be said for them coming over to England. So I think there is something about that. I don't think the construct of race will go away. I think people are thinking about it more because they have to. There's no choice right now. And they're thinking about ways that you can move around it. And I think when Christina was talking about the tree song and about how it was developed and how it was coming from a place of difference, it made me think about this approach that I used to work at Arts Council England for about 9 years. It was my first big job in England, really. And one of the approaches we developed was called the Creatory Case for Arts, for equality and diversity in the arts. And the idea behind that was diversity exists. You don't have to look for it. It's all around us. It's the constructs that make you, that kind of keep people out, if you like. And that actually, if you put diversity in the mix of anything, you are going to get to excellence. So this idea that you produce this piece of work, how does that inspire people to start making work and thinking about work very differently? I think you think of people like Clarence Adu, who was the Ghanaian sort of like, I feel like it wasn't saxophone, but it was one of the wind instrument players, and he got into an accident and he became a quadriplegic. And of course, when you're a musician, that is your life, you need to be able to play. So then the questions of who decides on what playing is, does it have to be there? So somebody's designed an instrument called Headspace, which allowed him to think about it and make the music. And what he's gone on to do now is he's got a paraplegic children's orchestra that played during the Cultural Olympiad here. And what a lovely way to kind of remind people that actually it's all these constructs around you say, you can't play, you can't write, you can't communicate yourself because you can't fit into these neat little boxes. So I think there's something about the construct that we need to constantly keep challenging that, it's overwhelming, and it can actually be a little depressing because you see it around you. You see it in the way that the economy is set up. You see it in the way that world trade happens, the way we tour from Africa to the rest of the world. Who decides all those touring routes, like what Christina said, the routes that allow you to travel, the ones that force you to go through Paris or Europe to get to the same continent? Where would Europe have to travel? Anywhere to get back to the rest of Europe. And who's decided that? And we know there's an end game to that. But actually, what do we need to do? What do we do as Africans in terms of how do we start really thinking about the constructs? This whole tribalism, we have it a lot in Nigeria, but because my father's from the north and my mum's from the south, I've never got into that space. I just try and deal with people how I find them. I can't say I'm always perfect, but I really try to meet you as I find you. If you're nice and you're cool with me, then I'm going to deal with you in that way. But I do think this whole idea of constructs, we're seeing it within the LGBTQ space, the trans space, the fluidity space of people who are non-conforming. They're saying, I don't feel like a woman and I don't feel like a man, and I'm not conforming to what you're telling me that I have to be. And I think that's very strong and it's very bold, and that's about people making a stand. So there are ways to make a stand. I don't know how I would do it around race, given that this kind of speaks before you do. But I think I'd be very interested to know how people would approach that.
So interesting, very interesting, and a beautifully articulated response to my question. I think further to undoing, and especially where our identity, and just to bring it back to artists and how we relate to our human rights and our identity and undoing all of that. You know, Nikki, earlier on, you spoke about the work that you do, and part of the work that you do is creating platforms for artists within their space, because there's something about performing within your own space and not really having to go too far to be appreciated for what you do. And I think we can all relate to that, particularly with what you've been saying about traveling and having to get all over the world just to come back to do the same thing. And I think part of undoing, and I'll speak from the space of the dance sector, particularly in South Africa, and it's becoming a big conversation about undoing the colonialism of, to be a respected dancer, to be a respected practitioner, I need to have had so many years of ballet training, whereas somebody who walks into the same room that has the same amount of traditional Tswana training is not deemed the same. And I think that's part of the undoing and reclaiming our identity. But it becomes very, very difficult because we're obviously still operating in somewhat largely colonial settings. You know, and part of undoing as well and really rewriting history for the sake of identity and representation. And I'd like us to talk about this a little bit, even though she's not here, but I think it's really important because, again, Nikki, you touched on it earlier when you spoke about representation of refugees and what you would find on Google if you had to put in the word refugee. And, you know, you said it very well earlier, but I just want to speak a little bit about Bathsheba's article that she wrote in conjunction with Cara Blackmore, Bathsheba Ncube, who I spoke about earlier, who was supposed to be here with us, but she's not. And she was part of writing this article with Cara Blackmore, Repairing Representational Wounds, Artistic and Curatorial Approaches to Traditional, to Transition After War. And I thought this was quite an interesting topic where the article focuses on two pieces of artwork. The first one being, let me just find it. Sorry, please give me a moment. So the first one talks about Kanyo Love, which is an incredible artwork that is about the aftermath of war through an exploration of courtship gifts that were received by the former wives of the Lord's Resistance Army. Now, the Lord's Resistance Army, who was at war with the government of Uganda. So in essence, after the war, these women received these, I suppose, you know, gifts of love from their soldier husbands who had now come home after the war. But prior to the fact, the war and the representation thereof on mainstream media is exactly what you spoke of, Nikki. And here we are after the war, which was probably about a 2-decade war, I could be mistaken, but here it is now, this artwork that is presenting the war in a very different way through the lens of these women that were left behind and finally their husbands come back, which then gives us a completely different narrative of this war than what we got through the mainstream media and their idea of what a refugee is. You know, another one that I'd like to touch on is Gang Kikoma and other things we left behind. And similarly, it gives us a different representation of the war, but this time we get to see some of the objects that were used by the refugees during the war. So, you know, you get displaced in war, I can only imagine, and you start collecting little things here and there as time goes by to keep you going. And this artwork is those things that people used over the years to keep them going as refugees. Once again, giving us a completely different representation of the war. So I'd like to open this to any of you ladies who'd like to respond to this juxtaposition of what we're fed and then how we as artists come in later on to rectify the wrong. And yeah, I'll open the platform and allow anybody to respond to that. Maybe you, Christina?
Yes, absolutely. That's incredibly provoking. Shifting representation. I mean, one of the way I sort of think about the problematics of representation is this problem that we always see more and less than what is there to be seen. I mean, we're so quick through our eyes and sort of in online spaces and in like media spaces, it's almost like we're dealing with shorthand of events. You know, we default so quickly to what we see in front of the screen, and we see either more, we make up stories, we bring our own context to it, or we see less. We don't see the image for what it is fully. So I think that, so many thoughts. I think that it's not only about necessarily shifting the image itself, but there's a huge opportunity for artists in Africa to even open up the categories themselves. So, I mean, I hear this in how Nikki is talking about her work, how it crosses over from comedy into sport, into fashion, into other artistic practices. So I think it's also about saying, you know, these genre boundaries that we are given, that are given to us, you know, this is dance. And you mentioned it earlier, you have to have this many years of training to be considered a dancer. So this idea of this is dance and this is music. And I think within an African context, there is a huge possibility to almost rethink this as an umbrella term of embodied arts. So how is ritual part of this? How is craft part of this? How is agriculture, working with the land, how is that part of it? It's to open up even the categories that we're working in beyond even just the images. And then realizing that I think when we make these kinds of aesthetic moves, we're making political moves. You know, we're making ethical and political moves when we make these aesthetic choices in how we recombine the materials that we're working with, because we can. We don't have to stay within those categories. And I think that changes what we value as knowledge and what we value as artistic practice. Nika, perhaps you have something more on that.
I just love what you just said, because I 100% agree with you about the deconstruction of form. Who decided that dance is this and that? And actually, when I look at, I used to work at the Arts Council for 9 years, and I ran a very similar showcase for the Arts Council for African, Asian and Caribbean artists. And over again, you would start to find more and more artists would define themselves in the combined space, which allow you to add dance and theatre and music together. And they would start off by saying, oh, there's not enough Black artists that do combined arts. And I'm like, it's the way you define. When I changed the definition and I said it's one or more art forms, a mixture of art forms, and it doesn't have to be performing arts, the increase went way up. And I do think there's something about the way these things are constructed for a Eurocentric gaze, and actually that puts pressure, because it starts to shift the way people make work. Because if they want to tour it, they know they have to make it in a particular way. They can't have 100 people on stage, you can only have 2, because the tour cannot afford that. So I think you're right. I think there is something about us just defining it on our, I think it's all about unmasking, unearthing indigenous forms that might feed into contemporary. And you see a lot of that in South Africa, I have to say. They're very good, especially with the dance. They are excellent at mixing the two and bringing in the contemporary space. I don't think we've quite got there yet in Nigeria, but then you see Senegal's very strong, Mali, Burkina Faso, and then you start to ask yourself why, and that's the Francophone influence. The French at the time of colonization were investing in ballet centers with a theatre wing, and so theatre was an add-on, whereas the Brits were more about putting theatre onto the university campuses. So they've both got very different trajectories. But I think for me, South Africa is incredibly strong across the performing music, theatre, dance, live up, they're very, very strong. The only thing I can't say I love is your fashion. I like your street fashion, the way people dress. I like the way you guys do hair, but when I see the fashion designers, I'm not feeling it. I must probably get all these people sending me all these names of designers. But I think across the board, South Africans are incredibly powerful. I mean, you see the dance, you want to cry. You know, you see the theatre, you're like, wow. And we saw Greg Minacoma's Sion. We presented it as part of PACE, and then I saw it back in the UK. And I had friends that I hadn't seen for years come to it, and they were crying afterwards saying, I'm never going to see that piece again. I said, we're going to have to find out where it's touring and get there. But basically, so many people in the audience were clapping. I just felt so proud that that came from an African gang. When we showed it at PACE, most of the West Africans said to me, was that done by a black man? I said, yeah. Was it done by an African? I said, yeah. Was he black? I said, yeah. They said, wow, a black African man did that? They all started thinking about what does it mean to do dance? What does it mean to do dance theatre? It's very, 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 very powerful indeed. I'm always inspired when I come to South Africa. Your interior design, your housing design, across the board, can't knock you. Very, very dynamic country. There's something about what's happened in your history and your time-tested traditions that mix and bring into the contemporary space that's very, 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 very powerful. Very powerful.
Absolutely incredible. And I don't even want to mess it up by adding anything more. What I love about what you said is just deconstructing of everything. And honestly, when you put it the way that you've just put it, Nikki, and rolling off of that was really a domino effect from what you've said, Christina, which then Nikki just rounded it off for us. And I think if we can look at it that way, we might have an opportunity to do some real shaping of identity through migration. That was such a beautiful, multi-level and absolutely rich conversation. And I think we could have gone on for a little bit longer if we were able to, but I would like to thank you, Christina Johnston, who is here in Pretoria, South Africa, and Nikki Jonah, who is in London, UK. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you for your in-depth intellect in helping us unpack this topic. I honestly feel much richer from this experience. And thank you so much, Artfluence, and everybody that is involved in this incredible initiative. Stay with us, I think, till the 8th of May, and we will have more of these absolutely incredible conversations. But from me, Lesotho van Niekerk, it has been an absolute pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you. Thank you so much.
Think moments and memory make magic and movies shared between sons and daughters or just friends in their quarter. More music, more movement, more space for amusement, where history was made and the future is paved. Adventure awaits. Together, embraced. Just down the highway. Think Midlands, my way.